I see you there, in the shadows of your solitude, where tears fall silently and prayers seem to bounce back from heaven's gates. The emptiness in your chest feels like an abandoned home, where even memories bring more pain than comfort. You've been searching for an answer, a sign, something to hold on to when everything else has slipped through your fingers. The weight of your silence has become your closest companion, heavier than any burden you've carried before. I know this place well, for I too have walked through this valley of echoing absence. But what if I told you that this very silence holds the seed of your rebirth? That in this seeming void, the divine is working most intimately with your soul? I remember the night when silence became my teacher. It was after I had lost everything familiar, when even my own voice seemed foreign to my ears. The stars watched as I questioned not just my path, but my very existence. That night, in the depths of my despair, I discovered a truth that would forever change how I understood God's presence in our moments of deepest pain. Long before I became the man whose words would travel across centuries, I was simply a seeker, tormented by questions that burned like fire in my chest. I walked the streets of Kenya with a heart so full of longing, it threatened to burst the confines of my ribs. I spoke of God. I taught about God, yet I felt a distance growing between us like a canyon carved by time. My prayers echoed in chambers of doubt, my certainties crumbled like ancient walls. And then, the silence came, not as a visitor, but as a flood that washed away all my carefully constructed beliefs. It began with a loss so profound that words failed to capture its depth. The one who had awakened my soul, my beloved Shams, disappeared without warning, leaving me stranded on the shores of a grief I had no map to navigate. I searched frantically, calling his name until my voice grew hoarse. I sent messengers to distant lands. I pleaded with God for a sign, a whisper, anything to fill the terrible silence that had become my world. Nights passed where sleep eluded me, and I sat alone in my chamber, the oil lamp casting long shadows on the walls. "Speak to me," I begged the darkness. "Give me a sign that you still hear me." But the heavens remained silent, or so I thought at the time. For what I interpreted as absence was in truth a different kind of presence, one that required a new way of listening. One evening, exhausted by my own questioning, I stopped struggling. I simply sat and allowed the silence to envelop me completely. No prayers formed on my lips, no demands rose from my heart, just pure, receptive stillness. And in that moment, something shifted. The silence was no longer empty. It had texture, depth, even a kind of music to it. I realized with startling clarity that God had not abandoned me. God was speaking to me through the silence itself, a language more intimate than words could ever be. What I discovered in that transformative night was that silence is not the absence of divine voice, it is the presence of divine listening. When all other voices fade, when our own clamoring quiets, we enter the sacred chamber where soul meets beloved. This is the profound paradox. In our most abandoned moments, we are most held. In our deepest solitude, we are least alone. The silence that you fear is not God's withdrawal. It is God creating space within you for a new kind of communion. I learned to treat my silence as holy ground. Each morning before dawn, I would sit in the stillness, not to fill it with my requests or even gratitude, but simply to be present to the presence that permeated everything. I placed my hand upon my chest and followed the rise and fall of my breath, recognizing each inhale as divine gift, each exhale as surrender. 3 minutes was all I asked of myself at first, but those 3 minutes became a doorway into eternity. Do this today. Find a quiet corner where you will not be disturbed. Sit with your spine straight but not rigid. Place your palm over your heart. Close your eyes and simply follow your breath for 3 minutes. Do not judge what arises, thoughts, emotions, sensations. Simply observe them as a witness would, with compassionate detachment. When you notice your mind wandering, gently return to the sensation of breathing. This practice is not about achieving perfect stillness. It is about developing the muscle of return. Each time you come back to your breath, you are strengthening your capacity to return to the divine presence. The wound that cannot speak finds voice in silence. What the tongue cannot express, the heart receives in stillness. This truth came to me not through study, but through lived experience, through nights of weeping and days of wondering. It came through the gradual understanding that God does not always communicate through dramatic revelations or clear directions. Sometimes, often, God speaks in the language of patient waiting, of gentle unfolding, of questions that ripen slowly into wisdom. Your pain has created a hollow space within you. This feels like devastation, but I tell you it is preparation. The cup must be emptied before it can be filled anew. The field must lie fallow before fresh planting. Your silence is not punishment or abandonment. It is the necessary clearing for what wishes to take root in you next. God has not turned away from your suffering. God has entered it so completely that you cannot distinguish the divine presence from your own breath. Faith is not the absence of darkness, but the courage to remain open when no light is visible. It is the willingness to listen when no words come. It is the trust that silence is not empty but pregnant with possibility. I do not offer you easy answers or quick remedies. The path through silence requires patience and the tender discipline of showing up day after day, sitting with what is, neither grasping nor rejecting. Remember, even when your prayers seem to dissolve into nothingness, they are being heard by an ear more attentive than any human could offer. Even when your tears fall in solitude, they are being gathered by hands more gentle than you can imagine. The silence that feels like abandonment is actually invitation to a deeper listening, a more profound surrender, a more authentic communion with the beloved who has never left your side, not for a single breath. The scars you carry are not signs of your weakness, but testaments to your journey. I, too, have fallen more than once into the abyss of my own making. I have returned to habits I swore to abandon, sought comfort in places that only deepened my wounds, and knocked desperately on doors that were never meant to open for me. There were days when I questioned whether the divine had forgotten me, when I begged for signs as a starving man begs for bread, when the distance between my reality and my aspirations stretched like an endless desert before me. In the months after Shams disappeared from my life, I wandered through the markets of Kanya like a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. My teachings became hollow, my poetry dried up like a stream in drought, and a heaviness settled in my chest that made each breath feel like labor. I sought distraction in endless conversations, in books that once illuminated my mind but now cast only shadows, in rituals that had lost their meaning. I was trapped in a cycle of seeking and disappointment, grasping for what had been instead of opening to what could be. I know you carry similar burdens. The relationship that shattered despite your best efforts to hold it together. The addiction you conquered only to fall back into its embrace when life became too sharp-edged. The dream you pursued with all your heart that dissolved like morning mist. The faith you once held with certainty that now feels like a language you can barely remember. I know the shame that follows these perceived failures, how it whispers that you are unworthy, unlovable, unfixable. I know the weight of comparing your broken present to your idealized past or to the seemingly perfect lives of others. But I want to ask you a question, and I ask you to be honest with me and yourself. What if these wounds are not punishments but invitations? What if the very experiences that make you feel most broken are actually breaking you open to receive a love and wisdom that could not enter through any other door? If this touches something real inside you, if you recognize this struggle between who you are and who you believe you should be, write in the comments, "My wounds are not my failure." When you share this truth, you're not just liberating yourself. You're extending a hand to someone else walking through the same dark forest, someone who feels utterly alone in their struggle. Your courage to speak your truth may be the exact medicine another soul has been praying for. 1. Winter night, as I sat beside the small brazier in my room, watching the coals pulse with inner fire, I had a revelation that changed how I viewed my suffering. I realized that God was not waiting for me to become perfect before drawing near. God was not standing at a distance, arms folded, until I could present a self without flaws or fractures. No, God was present in the very cracks that made me feel most ashamed. The divine had taken residence precisely in those broken places, not as judgment, but as intimate companion. This is the paradox that conventional wisdom cannot grasp. Your weakness is not an obstacle to the divine. It is the doorway. Your struggles are not evidence of God's absence, but the very soil in which deeper faith takes root. What appears as failure in the eyes of the world may be a necessary unraveling in the economy of the soul. The places where you feel most vulnerable are where genuine transformation becomes possible. I began to treat my wounds differently after this understanding dawned. Instead of hiding them or trying desperately to heal them through sheer will, I acknowledged them with compassion. I placed a hand on my heart each morning and spoke softly to the broken places within me. I see you. I honor the pain you carry. I will not abandon you, even if healing comes slowly. This simple practice, this gesture of self-compassion, became a bridge back to life, back to God, back to myself. Try this today. Find a quiet moment and place your hand over the center of your chest. Close your eyes and call to mind a wound you carry, a regret, a loss, a failure that still causes pain. Rather than turning away from this tender spot, breathe gently into it. Speak to it as you would to a child who is hurting, with patience, with kindness, with reassurance that they are not alone. Say, "This pain is part of my journey, not the end of it. I hold it with compassion." Do this for just 3 minutes. Notice how this small act of witnessing can begin to transform your relationship with your own suffering. The wound that receives tender attention becomes a vessel. What we dare not touch remains a barrier. This truth emerged not from books, but from lived experience, from learning to stay present with my own brokenness rather than fleeing from it. The parts of ourselves we reject cannot heal. They can only fester in the shadows of our avoidance. But when met with gentle awareness, even our deepest injuries can become sources of unexpected grace. Here is another truth I discovered on this path. Memory is not your master unless you make it so. For months after losing Shams, I lived in the prison of remembrance, constantly comparing the vibrant then to the colorless now. Each memory became a knife that cut me anew. Until one day, beside the fountain in the courtyard of the madrasa, I watched how water flowed continuously, never clinging to any particular form or moment, and I understood. I had been clutching my memories, like treasures that defined me, rather than allowing them to pass through me like water through cupped hands. From that day forward, I practiced a different relationship with my past. When memories arose, beautiful or painful, I acknowledged them with a soft, "Yes, this too has been part of my journey," and then gently returned to the present moment. I did not deny what had happened, but neither did I allow it to determine what was possible now. This practice of neither suppressing nor indulging the stories of the past gradually loosened their hold on me. The memories remained, but their power to define me diminished. Faith is not the absence of wounds, but the courage to allow them to be transformed. It is not about erasing your scars, but discovering how they connect you more deeply to your own humanity and to the suffering of others. The very experiences that make you feel most isolated can become bridges to profound connection when you learn to carry them with dignity rather than shame. Remember, God is not waiting on the other side of your healing. God is present in the very process of it, in each small step toward self-forgiveness, in every moment you choose compassion over condemnation. Your brokenness is not a barrier to the sacred, it is sacred ground itself. Walk gently there, with reverence for all that you have survived, and all that is being born in you even now, in this very moment of reading these words. There comes a moment in the spiritual journey when everything you thought you knew dissolves like salt in water. All your carefully constructed understandings, all your practiced devotions, all your accumulated wisdom, they suddenly seem hollow, inadequate, even false. I reached such a point after months of searching for shams, when my prayers had grown mechanical, my mind scattered like leaves in autumn wind, and my soul cowered like a frightened animal in the corner of my being. I opened my mouth to recite the prayers I had known since childhood, but what emerged was not praise, but a raw, unfiltered cry. Where are you when I need you most? No thunderous response came, no dramatic sign appeared in the heavens. Only a thick silence settled around me like a heavy blanket on a winter night. At first, I interpreted this silence as abandonment, as confirmation of my deepest fear, that God had turned away from me, that I had been left to navigate the darkness alone. I felt the foundations of my faith cracking beneath me, and I began to fall, not physically, but in that interior space where meaning and purpose reside. This inner falling is terrifying. I know the vertigo you feel when old certainties slip away, when the spiritual practices that once sustained you seem empty of power, when God feels more like an echo than a presence. I know the particular anxiety of wondering whether everything you believed was merely a comforting illusion. I have tasted the bitterness of spiritual drought when the well you've drawn from for years suddenly runs dry, leaving only dust and stones. But here's what I discovered in that descent. The silence that I mistook for divine absence was actually divine surgery. It was not punishment, but purification. The quiet was not denying my pain. It was creating a container large enough to hold it without allowing it to define me completely. In that stillness, a simple but profound insight flickered to life. Do not flee this emptiness. And so, against every instinct that urged me to distract myself, to find quick answers or easy consolations, I stayed. I breathed through the discomfort, counting each inhalation and exhalation as if they were precious coins. With each breath out, I released one more expectation of how my spiritual life should look. With each breath in, I received a small measure of peace, not the dramatic peace I had been seeking, but a subtle, almost imperceptible quieting. It was so modest a gift that I might have missed it entirely had I not been stripped of all my grander hopes. And yet, within that minimal tranquility, a memory surfaced. An ordinary morning long ago when I had washed a simple clay dish with complete attention, feeling the cool water on my hands, watching the play of light on the wet surface, and experiencing in that mundane act a perfect contentment. Why did this particular memory come to rescue me from despair? I believe it was to teach me that faith is not always a lightning strike of revelation. Sometimes it is a slender thread of presence woven through the fabric of our ordinary days. In my most elaborate prayers and ecstatic moments of worship, I had not been any closer to God than I was while washing that humble dish with a quiet mind and open heart. If these words are touching something deep in you, if you feel this conversation is for your soul, subscribe to this channel. Here I share teachings for those seeking truth, transformation, and the awakening of the heart. Activate the bell so my words continue reaching you. I held on to that thread of simple presence. I did not try to solve the great mysteries or recapture dramatic spiritual experiences. I merely committed to showing up each day with as much awareness as I could gather. I began with the most basic elements of existence: breath, water, food, movement. I drank a cup of water each morning with complete attention, feeling the cool liquid traveling from my lips to my throat to my center. I broke bread with mindfulness, noticing texture and taste without rushing to the next bite. I walked in the garden with deliberate steps, feeling the earth support my weight, the air caress my skin. None of these practices seemed special or significant. They did not restore me immediately to spiritual certainty or emotional equilibrium, but they kept me connected to something beyond my pain, something that neither required nor responded to my desperate grasping. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, a new kind of faith began to take shape within me, not the confident, declarative faith of my earlier years, but a quieter, more resilient trust that could coexist with questions and uncertainties. I offer you this simple practice that sustained me through my darkest night. For 3 consecutive days, choose one ordinary activity: drinking water, washing your hands, walking from one room to another, and perform it with complete attention. Feel the sensations in your body. Notice the thoughts that arise without following them down their various paths. When your mind wanders, gently bring it back to the physical experience of the moment. This is not a complicated spiritual technique. It is simply a way of anchoring yourself in the present when the past haunts you and the future frightens you. What appears as falling may actually be finding ground. The descent that terrifies can become the foundation that supports. This understanding did not come to me through intellectual reasoning, but through lived experience, through allowing myself to be stripped of illusions without knowing what would replace them. It came through learning to trust not in my spiritual achievements, but in the mysterious process that sometimes dismantles us in order to rebuild us more authentically. The inner fall is not the end of your spiritual journey. It is a crucial reorientation. When we lose our familiar landmarks, we are forced to develop new ways of navigating, new capacities for discernment, new humilities that make us more receptive to truth. What feels like regression is often necessary recalibration. What appears as failure may be the shattering of a container too small for the life trying to emerge through you. I gradually came to recognize that my desperate question, "Where are you when I need you most?" contained a profound misconception. I had been looking for God as something separate from my experience, as an external presence that would validate my pain or rescue me from it. But the divine reality I eventually encountered was not apart from my suffering. It was intimately woven into it, not as its cause, but as the capacity to bear it, to move through it, to be transformed by it. Faith matures when it can embrace not just consolation, but also desolation, not just finding, but also losing, not just ascending, but also descending. The spiritual life is not a continuous upward trajectory, but a spiral that sometimes requires us to revisit old wounds with new awareness, to face familiar challenges with deeper resources. What sets authentic faith apart from mere belief is precisely this ability to integrate the full spectrum of human experience without dividing it into the sacred and the profane. When you find yourself in the midst of an inner fall, resist the urge to claw your way back to familiar ground. Instead, ask yourself, what is this descent trying to teach me? What false certainties need to be released? What deeper truth is waiting to be discovered? Trust that the same love that sustains the stars in their courses is holding you, even in your falling. Trust that meaning and purpose can be reconstituted, often in more authentic forms, after periods of disintegration. Remember this: the collapse of one way of understanding God creates space for a larger, more nuanced comprehension to emerge. The death of a limited faith can be the birth canal for a more expansive spirituality. When you cannot feel God's presence in the ways you once did, consider that you are being invited into a more mature relationship with the divine, one that requires fewer signs and wonders because it is grounded in the simple miracle of existence itself. The journey now turns a vital corner. After walking through the valley of silence, after confronting your wounds, after experiencing the inner fall that strips away false certainties, you arrive at the threshold of transformation. I discovered this threshold not in a moment of ecstatic revelation, but in the quiet realization that dawned like a gentle sunrise. Faith is not primarily a matter of feeling, but of faithfulness. The heart does not mature through occasional bursts of emotion, but through patient, consistent practice. This truth runs counter to what the world often proclaims, that spiritual growth depends on dramatic experiences, on constant inspiration, on uninterrupted clarity. Let me share with you what I learned about the subtle discipline that nurtures the soul. In the months following my deepest despair over the loss of Shams, I continued to perform the ritual prayers, to teach in the madrasa, to attend to my family and community. I did these things not because I felt inspired, but because I recognized that the path forward required commitment rather than constant consolation. Some mornings I rose before dawn feeling only heaviness, my heart like a stone in my chest. The mihrab in the mosque that had once seemed to glow with divine light now appeared as just carved stone. The sacred words I recited sometimes felt like pebbles in my mouth. Yet I continued. Not mechanically, not with empty formality, but with an intention to remain open, to keep showing up at the appointed times in the appointed places. I began to understand that the light does not always come to entertain us with its brilliance. More often, it comes to train us in steadfastness. The divine is not seeking perfect emotions from us, but perfect attendance, the willingness to bring our flawed, fluctuating selves to the practice day after day, regardless of what we feel or do not feel. From this understanding emerged 3 simple disciplines that gradually transformed my inner landscape. I offer them to you now, not as burdens to be carried, but as lamps to illuminate your path through difficult terrain. First, the practice of conscious silence. Not just the absence of speech, but the presence of awareness. Each day, dedicate 3 minutes to sitting in complete stillness with your eyes closed. Place your attention on your breath as gently as you would place a small bird in your open palm. Do not try to control the breath. Simply observe its natural rhythm, the rising and falling, the pause between exhalation and inhalation. When thoughts arise, and they will, like clouds drifting across the sky, do not fight them or follow them. Simply name what appears, planning, remembering, worrying, hoping. Then return your attention to the breath. This practice seems incredibly simple, yet it is here, in this basic attendance to what is most fundamental, that God speaks most clearly. Second, the creation of small, reliable order in your external life. Choose one modest action that you will perform each day with complete attention and care, making your bed with precision, washing your dishes immediately after eating, organizing your workspace before beginning your tasks. These may appear to be mundane activities with no spiritual significance, but I discovered that, when performed with reverence, these simple gestures of order in the visible world begin to create corresponding order in the invisible realm of the soul. The chaos that often seems to engulf us begins to recede when we establish these islands of intentional care. Third, the discipline of service or gratitude. Each day, perform one small act of kindness without seeking recognition. Offer assistance to someone who cannot repay you. Listen fully to another person without waiting for your turn to speak. Or, if circumstances do not permit direct service, take a moment to write down 3 specific expressions of gratitude, not vague appreciations, but precise acknowledgments of particular blessings. I am grateful for the morning light that entered my window at dawn. I am grateful for the taste of cool water when I was thirsty. I am grateful for the stranger who smiled at me on the street. This practice redirects the heart from its habitual focus on what is lacking to a recognition of what is abundantly present. When faithful hands tend the garden of practice, flowers bloom that no season can wither. This understanding came to me not through intellectual study, but through lived experience, through days when I performed these disciplines with nothing but trust that they were slowly preparing the soil of my being for seeds I could not yet name. It came through learning that spiritual growth rarely follows the dramatic arc we desire. Instead, it unfolds through thousands of small choices that may seem insignificant in the moment, but collectively create the conditions for profound transformation. I noticed changes so subtle I almost missed them. A moment of irritation that passed more quickly than before, a worry that arose but did not consume my entire attention, a small joy that I was able to receive fully instead of dismissing or diminishing. The harsh internal voice that had long criticized my efforts grew quieter, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the gradual cultivation of a gentler, more patient relationship with myself. The compulsive seeking for answers beyond my reach slowly gave way to a more trusting engagement with the questions themselves. This is the secret that many spiritual teachings obscure. The most profound transformations often occur not through extraordinary experiences, but through faithful attention to ordinary moments. The divine reality we seek is not hiding in some remote, exalted realm accessible only through rare states of consciousness. It is woven into the very fabric of our daily existence, waiting to be recognized and reverenced through practices simple enough for a child to understand, yet profound enough to occupy a lifetime of deepening. God is not impressed by the complexity of our spiritual technologies or the eloquence of our prayers. The divine heart responds to consistency, to the humble willingness to begin again and again when we falter, to the courage to remain open even when the path seems unclear. Each small act of discipline is a declaration of faith more powerful than any creed or doctrine, a lived statement that says, I trust the process of growth even when I cannot see the results. I believe that faithfulness matters even on days when inspiration is absent. The discipline of the heart establishes a foundation that emotions alone cannot provide. When joy comes, and it will return like spring after winter, it finds a vessel prepared to receive it without grasping. When sorrow comes, and it too will visit, like clouds gathering before rain, it finds a structure capable of honoring its presence without being overwhelmed by it. What began as deliberate practice gradually becomes natural orientation, a way of being in the world that is both deeply rooted and freely flowing. Remember this, the light does not always announce itself with brilliance. Sometimes it works quietly, like yeast in dough, transforming everything from within. The disciplines I have shared with you are not ends in themselves, but channels through which divine presence can flow more freely into your life. Practice them not with rigid perfectionism, but with gentle persistence. On days when you forget or falter, begin again without self-condemnation. The path is not a straight line, but a spiral that sometimes seems to return to familiar territory, though always at a different level of understanding. The transformation does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives like dawn, gradually illuminating what was always present but hidden in darkness. After months of practicing the disciplines I shared with you, conscious silence, small order, and daily service or gratitude, I began to notice subtle shifts in my inner landscape. These changes were not dramatic revelations, but quiet realignments, as if something essential was finding its proper place within me. My mind, once caught in endless spirals of questioning and doubt, began to settle like a lake after wind has ceased. My heart, which had felt so constricted with grief, expanded enough to hold both sorrow and sweetness without being defined by either. I discovered God's presence in details I had previously overlooked, the quality of silence that comforts rather than threatens, the sufficiency of simple food when eaten with awareness, the humble altar of an organized space that reflects outer harmony and invites inner peace. Work, which had become a battlefield where I struggled against distraction and resistance, gradually transformed into a field of mindful service. The words I wrote flowed more naturally, no longer forced from a place of striving, but emerging from a deeper well of authentic presence. My interactions with others lost some of their jagged edges. I found myself listening more fully, speaking more purposefully, holding space for differences without the immediate need to convince or convert. Perhaps most surprisingly, material provision arrived with an ease I had not experienced before. Not excessive wealth that burdens the spirit with attachment, but sufficient resources that aligned with purpose and arrived through honorable means. It was as if clearing the inner channels through discipline had also cleared the outer paths through which abundance could flow. When the soul aligns with its true nature, a wise dervish once told me, the material world responds accordingly. I discovered the truth of these words not through magical thinking, but through the natural order that emerges when our inner and outer lives find proper relationship. I share these observations not to promise specific outcomes, but to illustrate a principle. When we attend faithfully to the state of our hearts, the external circumstances of our lives often begin to reflect that inner alignment. This is not the shallow promise that spiritual practice will make you rich or famous or perpetually happy. It is the deeper recognition that genuine transformation radiates outward from center to circumference, from essence to expression, from root to fruit. One ordinary afternoon, as I sat in my small garden practicing the 3 minutes of silence that had become as essential to me as bread and water, I felt the gentle breeze touch my face like a whisper, saying simply, "Continue." This was not an emotional surge or mystical vision, just a quiet confirmation that I was on the right path. I realized in that moment that what I had been seeking was not absent. It had been present all along, waiting for me to develop the capacity to perceive it. The heavens had not been silent during my darkest nights. They had been speaking in a language I was only now learning to understand. Where patient practice lights a single candle, Darkness that seemed eternal finds its boundary. This insight crystallized not through intellectual reasoning, but through lived experience, through witnessing how the consistent disciplines of the heart gradually illuminated corridors of my being that had long been shrouded in shadow. It came through recognizing that transformation is less like a sudden storm and more like the changing of seasons, a process so gradual we may fail to notice it until we suddenly realize we are standing in a different landscape than the one we remember. The sign you seek may not come as dramatic intervention or unmistakable miracle. It may arrive as subtle shift in perception, as newfound ability to remain centered in the midst of circumstances that once would have completely overwhelmed you. It may appear as the quiet recognition that you are no longer haunted by a particular fear or driven by a specific compulsion. It may manifest as increased capacity to be present with others without being drained by their needs or defined by their opinions. I remember the first time I realized that I could speak of shams without feeling the knife edge of grief cutting through my chest. I mentioned his name in response to a student's question, and only afterward did I notice that the words had flowed naturally, that I had accessed the wisdom of our connection without being pulled under by the current of loss. This was not because the love had diminished, but because my heart had expanded to hold both the presence and the absence, both the gift and the taking away. Similarly, I noticed that the compulsive seeking that had characterized my early spiritual life, the desperate reaching for experiences, insights, confirmations, had been replaced by a more grounded receptivity. I no longer needed to chase after God like a hunter pursuing elusive prey. I had learned to create the conditions in which divine presence could find me, could work in me, could flow through me with less interference from my own agenda and expectations. These were my signs, not writing in the sky, but subtle shifts in the landscape of consciousness. They came not because I had achieved some pinnacle of spiritual perfection, but because I had established practices that allowed for natural unfolding. I had learned to cooperate with the process rather than attempting to control it. I had discovered how to participate in my own transformation without becoming obsessed with its pace or appearance. I offer you this perspective not to diminish your longing for clear guidance, but to expand your understanding of how that guidance often comes. The divine voice rarely needs to shout, because it speaks from within, from the very center of your being. The sign you seek is not hidden from you out of cruelty or indifference. It is being carefully calibrated to meet you precisely where you need it most, in a form you can genuinely receive rather than merely imagine. Practice this today. Set aside 15 minutes for reflection. Consider an area of your life where you have been seeking change or growth. Rather than focusing on what has not yet happened, bring your attention to subtle shifts that may have already occurred. Has a relationship improved in small but meaningful ways? Has an old reactive pattern weakened its hold on you? Have you noticed increased capacity to stay present during difficult emotions? Write down 3 specific observations, however modest they may seem. This practice helps train the eye of the heart to recognize transformation that is already underway, to cooperate more fully with what is emerging rather than remaining fixated on what appears to be missing. The paradoxical truth is this: the more we release our attachment to particular signs, the more clearly we can perceive the guidance that surrounds us. When we stop demanding that God speak to us in one specific language, we begin to recognize the countless dialects of divine communication, through nature, through other people, through circumstances, through the quiet promptings of our own deepened intuition. The sign does not need to be extraordinary to be authentic. It simply needs to orient you toward your next faithful step. Faith matures when it no longer depends on constant reassurance. Like a child who eventually learns to walk without holding a parent's hand, the soul develops confidence through practice, through falling and rising again, through discovering that divine support remains even when not visibly apparent. This is not blind faith, but tested trust, not naive optimism, but grounded hope that has weathered storms and found itself still standing. If you have been practicing the disciplines I shared with you and wondering whether transformation is occurring, look for these subtle signals: increased peace in the midst of unchanged circumstances, greater spaciousness around old triggers, moments of unexpected gratitude for what is rather than restless craving for what is not, the capacity to be alone without being lonely, the ability to serve without resentment, the courage to speak truth without aggression, the wisdom to listen without defensiveness. Remember this: what feels like slow progress is often deep integration. The divine works thoroughly rather than hastily, building foundations that will support the structure of your becoming. Trust the process, continue the practices, and maintain gentle vigilance for the signs that are already appearing, not with anxious searching, but with quiet confidence that what is meant for you will not miss its mark. I speak to you now from a place of hard-won equilibrium, of peace not purchased cheaply, but earned through faithful practice. The journey I have shared with you, through the silence of pain, the healing of wounds, the inner fall, the discipline of heart, and the subtle signs of transformation, has led me to understandings both simple and profound. These are not abstract theories, but lived truths etched into my being through experience, through days of darkness and moments of unexpected light. The first lesson is this: pain comes not to destroy, but to reveal. The silence that feels like abandonment is actually invitation to a deeper listening. What appears as wound becomes, when held with compassion, the very opening through which new life enters. The inner fall that terrifies us is often the necessary collapse of structures too small to contain our becoming. These are not pretty metaphors to decorate suffering, but practical recognitions that help us navigate life's most challenging passages. The second lesson follows naturally. Faith is cultivated like a modest garden, not manufactured like a grand monument. It requires daily attention to small but essential practices. The three disciplines I have shared, conscious silence, small order, and service or gratitude, form a triangle of stability within which transformation can safely occur. Water applied consistently, 3 minutes of attentive stillness each day. Soil kept nourished and clean, one gesture of physical order in your environment, light allowed to reach the growing things, one act of service or specific gratitude. With these simple elements, faith finds the conditions it needs to take root and flourish. The third lesson emerges from the first two. God's timing is neither punishment nor mistake. The silence that seems unending, the transformation that appears too slow. These are not evidence of divine indifference, but of divine wisdom that understands what we can genuinely receive at each stage of our journey. The fruit cannot be rushed without sacrificing sweetness. The dawn cannot be hurried without disrupting the necessary work of night. What feels like delay is often preparation, making ready the soil of our being for seeds that would be wasted on unprepared ground. I can tell you with quiet certainty that darkness does not have the final word. The night that engulfed me after Shams disappeared did not destroy my capacity for joy or purpose. The questions that shook the foundations of my faith did not ultimately weaken it, but rather stripped away what was superficial, leaving a more resilient core. The disciplines that sometimes felt like empty gestures gradually filled with meaning, becoming not obligations, but invitations to a more spacious way of being. Today, I can speak of loss without being consumed by it. I can acknowledge mystery without being paralyzed by it. I can offer guidance not from a position of having transcended human struggle, but from having moved through it with eyes and heart open, attentive to the lessons written in even the most painful chapters. This is not perfection, but integration, not escape from difficulty, but the capacity to remain present to all that life contains without fragmentation or flight. The purification of suffering, when met with conscious awareness, creates a particular kind of wisdom, not abstract or theoretical, but embodied and practical. This wisdom recognizes paradox without trying to resolve it prematurely. It acknowledges that silence can be both wound and medicine, that loss can be both ending and beginning, that discipline can be both limitation and liberation. It lives comfortably with tensions that the immature mind rushes to eliminate through oversimplification. I do not offer you a life without shadows. I do not promise that faithful practice will shield you from grief or confusion or seasons of apparent abandonment. What I can say with confidence is this: the silence that once terrified you can become a sanctuary where the deepest truths are heard. The order you create in small daily acts can become a foundation that holds steady when external circumstances crumble. The service you offer without expectation of return can become a channel through which unexpected grace flows back to you. Another truth I hold with gentle firmness: God does not arrive late to your need. What feels like divine delay is actually divine education, the development of capacities you will need not just for your own healing, but for the work you are being prepared to do in the world. The waiting that feels like wasted time is often the very crucible in which your unique gifts are being refined, your particular wisdom is being distilled, your authentic voice is finding its true timbre. I invite you now to a simple but potent practice. Sit in a comfortable position where you will not be disturbed. Close your eyes and bring to mind a challenge you are currently facing, a loss, a fear, an uncertainty that weighs on your heart. As you hold this difficulty in awareness, count 5 complete breaths, allowing each inhalation and exhalation to be slow and full. Then, on a small piece of paper, write 1 sentence of gratitude for something specific in your life right now. Finally, before you sleep tonight, perform 1 small act of service. Something as simple as sending a message of encouragement to someone who is struggling, organizing a space for another person's use, or preparing something that will make tomorrow easier for yourself or others. Peace is not the absence of storm, but the presence of anchor. Not silence imposed from without, but stillness cultivated from within. This understanding emerged not from theoretical speculation, but from weathering tempests that threatened to overwhelm my small vessel. It came through discovering that tranquility is not a permanent state to be achieved, but a practice to be returned to again and again, a way of being that can coexist with uncertainty and challenge. The ultimate paradox may be this: the peace we seek is not dependent on perfect circumstances or complete understanding. It is available precisely in the midst of questions without answers, in the space between what has been lost and what has not yet been found. It resides not in elimination of difficulty, but in expanded capacity to remain present, to breathe, to continue the essential practices even when their value is not immediately evident. I do not know what specific burden you carry as you hear these words. I cannot predict what particular path your healing and growth will take. But I can affirm with absolute conviction that the silence that feels like abandonment contains seeds of communion, that the disciplines that seem small can produce harvests beyond calculation, that the God who appears absent is actually at work in depths your surface awareness cannot yet perceive. If this message has resonated in your soul, subscribe and be part of this awakening journey. Each week I bring wisdom for those who have chosen the path of true transformation, and leave in the comments, "I embrace the discipline of peace." This simple declaration marks the beginning of your journey back home, back to yourself, back to the divine presence that has never left your side for even a single breath. The invitation I extend is not to perfect performance, but to faithful practice, not to dramatic breakthrough, but to consistent showing up at the thresholds where transformation occurs. 3 minutes of silence, 1 act of order, 1 gesture of service or gratitude. Begin with these and watch how they gradually expand your capacity for presence, for peace, for participation in the mystery that holds us all. Remember this, beloved friend: you are not alone in your struggle. The questions that keep you awake at night have been asked by countless seekers before you. The doubts that sometimes shadow your faith are not signs of spiritual failure, but of spiritual honesty. The disciplines that feel inadequate in the face of your deepest longings are nevertheless creating conditions for genuine growth, for authentic communion, for lasting peace. I close with this final encouragement: trust the silence. Not blindly or passively, but actively, through practices that keep you engaged with what is real, that ground you in your body, that connect you with others, that remind you of beauty that persists even in difficult seasons. The voice you have been straining to hear has never stopped speaking. It is simply inviting you to listen in a new way, with the ear of the heart, with the receptivity that comes through faithful attention to what is here, now, in this very moment of your unfolding life. The peace you seek is not waiting for you at some distant destination. It is germinating in the soil of your present circumstances, taking root in the ground of your faithful practice, preparing to bloom in ways you cannot yet imagine, but will recognize when the time is right. Continue, beloved. The path that passes through darkness leads eventually to dawn, and you are further along than you know.